Really what I was trying to do was to bring to the audience's attention that the value or the perceived value of antibiotics is actually very low. Unlike other drugs, cancer drugs, rheumatology drugs, so forth, where people are prepared to pay significantly more than they are prepared to pay for an antibiotic. Even though we know that an antibiotic can, just 1 week of an antibiotic can extend your life by decades, whereas these cancer and other treatments don't have that same sort of effect. I think society has become complacent. We've had antibiotics for 70 years, and up until recently they've always worked, and we have up until recently paid, let's say, $30 for a course of antibiotic, and it's generally worked. But now that antibiotic resistance has emerged and has become on the agenda of the WHO, CDC, even the PCAST, the US president. Now that antibiotic resistance is more than just a threat, it's a reality. New drugs are being developed, but because it's a new era and it costs more to develop an antibiotic now than it did 20 years ago, patients and physicians are not comfortable paying let's say $1,000, let alone $5,000 and $10,000 for a new antibiotic, which is likely to save their life. So complacency and almost antibiotics a disposable attitude. There's always another one I can go to and another one. Well, we're running out of those options, and at some stage, someone's got to pay the piper. Well, I think that what underlies C. diff as an infection is the profound disturbance to the protective normal flora. So usually a course of an antibiotic can do a lot of damage to that protective flora. So I think the most logical thing to think of is, let's replace that flora. Not perfectly to what your flora was, but at least enough to provide that layer of protection. So I think restoring the microbial flora, to me, is a very powerful way forward. It has its problems and pitfalls, several of which originate from the regulators, but that's beyond this discussion. I'm fascinated about the concept of vaccines. Vaccines have been proven to work in a variety of infections, but the problem is the uptake. And if you don't get enough uptake, then the sort of herd immunity doesn't kick in. So it sort of questions the validity of the vaccine. I mean, we're currently in influenza season, and I think if you went out onto the high street and asked how many people have had their flu shot, you'd probably be lucky to see 30 to 40%, I think. So vaccines, restoration of the microbial flora, those are the two key ones. I know we've looked at the, immunoglobulins and immune status in the past, but I think that has been a little bit non-specific. I think the specificity of a vaccine actually is better. So those are my two other options to antibiotics. Now, contingent valuation is a phrase that economists and insurance auditors and those people are familiar with. The medical profession doesn't get it, and it really applies to some form of health event, and in this case an infection. We're not just looking at the impact of the infection on that one patient, but the impact of that event on the patient's family, the patient's workplace, and a lot of things that come together in like a giant jigsaw. And if you look at contingent valuation for things like environmental disasters, that's how they use that process to come up with the value for, let's remember Deep Sea Horizon, the oil rig that exploded in Gulf of Mexico. The evaluation put that at almost $19 billion when they worked out all of the environmental issues and so forth, but I think it's time to assess infectious diseases in exactly the same way. So contingent valuation could help establish a more realistic pricing for antibiotics, not just go with a price that you think people might pay, but to actually look at the drugs for the impact they have on society. If you can eradicate a patient's pneumonia, that's a good thing, because not only have you cured their infection, that you've reduced the chance of that infection being spread and having a ripple effect. So I think it's time for us to think about infectious diseases with contingent valuation, and to better understand the holistic costs of an infection. There was a recent study published, I think probably 2 years ago, where they looked at all of the different components that go into managing and controlling a patient with C. diff, and it came to something in the order of $30,000. Now, if that patient happens to fail their treatment and recur, then, and that's about a 30% chance, then you're going to incur those costs again. So over a period of time, you're going from, let's say, a $30,000 cost to 60 to 90 and so forth. So it's difficult to take a singular C. diff infection as just $30,000. It's the avoidance of the recurrence that matters. And C. diff, when you compare it with other multi-drug resistant infections, is probably one of the top most expensive infections to acquire.